Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
We're moving right along here. I'm sort of on schedule, hoping to get through all of the presidents eventually, but trying to do two at a time is rather difficult, but I'm giving it the old college try. So, of course, before I get into Madison and Monroe, what did I forget from last week? Well, it would be unconscionable for me to leave out the letters that were sent between Adams and Jefferson. A great correspondence they had. It was a tragic shame that they fell out for so many years. They were rivals politically when they had been such close friends earlier on during the Revolutionary period. But after they were both president, Adams in retirement, Jefferson in retirement, both at their respective homes, a mutual friend of theirs realized that these two great titans of the Revolutionary period really needed to get back together, and so started writing to both of them, encouraging them to make up and become friends again. And eventually they did. Right around 1811, they started corresponding again, and there are a number of books out there that collect these letters or study these letters that you can find in the bookstores, describing these wonderful, lengthy, friendly letters that Adams and Jefferson sent to each other. Adams was the more prolific letter writer, but Jefferson wrote longer letters in order to make up for it. But a wonderful friendship that they had, and incredible letters to read. If you're ever inclined to read something like that, it's well worth your time. So James Madison and James Monroe, starting with Madison, the father of the Constitution, more than any other man contributed to the structure of government that we have today in the Constitutional Convention. Bibliography: Gary Wills, James Madison. Is anybody familiar with Gary Wills as an author? Great, entertaining guy to read. He can be very funny and very witty in his writings. So I could recommend just about anything he writes just for the entertainment value. And for those of you who are Catholic, he's written a number of books on popes and Catholic doctrine and that sort of thing that might be interesting as well. But yeah, so 184 pages, very quick read, entertaining, to the point, covers his whole life very briefly, but nicely done. Lynn Cheney, for some reason, decided she needed to write a biography of James Madison, and did very nicely. Very personal touch, I think, in her writings. Gives you a good feel of James Madison, still very scholarly. And of course, Dolly Madison, which I'll get into too, she describes very nicely. Well worth reading, and pretty in-depth with 563 pages. Noah Feldman, for me this was probably the most scholarly of the biographies, and still very entertaining. When you're at 773 pages, you really hope that you have a book that you can get through without too much damage to your psyche, without too much struggle. And this guy did a very good job of making it both entertaining and very scholarly too. And then the last one, Ralph Ketchum James Madison. It's scholarly work, a little on the bland side for me, so I don't have a lot to say about this one because I think I slept through half of it. So, and that's probably more my issue than his, but it's still a scholarly work. I shouldn't criticize too badly. So, born March 16th, 1751, Belle Grove, Virginia, the oldest of 12 children, although a lot of them did not make it. I think only 4, other than Madison, survived, which was fairly common. He was born on a plantation with slaves in Virginia. Fairly well-to-do family, had tutors that provided his education, and early on they recognized him as a prodigy, a young man who would study for hours on end and absorb it quite readily. Then graduated from Princeton, studied politics, philosophy, Hebrew, law, and oddly enough never became a lawyer. He didn't have to. He was raised in a fairly, like I said, well-to-do family, and just didn't feel like going to work as a lawyer because that's a rather tedious thing. You probably have to travel an awful lot as a lawyer, as many did. But he got into politics early on. That was his passion throughout his life. And as a founding father, he was first in the Virginia Constitutional Convention, worked on the Articles of Confederation, which, by the way, was our first constitution. People think of our Constitution as the one that we had always had, but during the Revolutionary War period, we had a different one, the Articles of Confederation, and that had to be worked out and voted on, and Madison was one of the key members in that debate and structuring of that government. And then when the Constitutional Convention came along, he was with his Virginia plan, which he presented to all of the delegates. That was the core of our Constitution. It was James Madison and who had constructed this by and large, and he was the one that everyone else worked from. That was the core of the government. Everything else was the details. And he also wrote notes copiously throughout the Constitutional Convention back in 1787, from which scholars today are very grateful to have, because it gives us a really good insight into the debates that were raging through that summer. He actually kept them secret through his lifetime, did not want anyone to see the debates until after he had passed. But there were other notes that he kept as well, the official notes of the Constitutional Convention as well. He actually wanted to keep those somewhat secret too, but they were divulged. And of course afterwards, the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, Hamilton in particular, wanting to get all of the states in, trying to convince everyone that this was the best constitution that we could have at the moment. And so they wrote a series of articles, the Federalist Papers, which are some of the best articles and commentary on our Constitution and what it means. And scholars today, I mean, if you're at all into political theory in college, you will study these. So some of the best, and Madison wrote quite a few of these articles. During Washington's administration, he started out as Washington's closest advisor. Washington valued him highly, and he would write speeches for Washington. They worked very closely together until Hamilton came along and presented his side of things, and Hamilton's assumption plan to pay off the debts, his plan for the bank, and a number of things. That is how really the political parties started. It was between Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison. So he went from being, at the beginning, Washington's closest advisor to the end of, at the end of Washington's administration, his greatest rival, along with Thomas Jefferson. Kind of a sad thing that they became such, there was such enmity between them, not openly, but certainly it was there. And especially with the Jay Treaty in the last couple of years of Washington's administration. The Jay Treaty with Great Britain, it was an awful treaty. As I mentioned in Washington's lecture on Washington, it was a terrible treaty for us. It was a great treaty for Great Britain, but it was probably the best we could do, and we needed it to prevent war. And Washington did everything he could to keep us from going to war with Great Britain, including this awful treaty. But Madison, who was a leader in the House of Representatives, at first felt that there wasn't really much he could do because it was the Senate, not the House, that votes on ratification, and the Senate passed it. So what's Madison going to do in the House of Representatives? Well, this is kind of a low point for Madison, very underhanded, but he decided that he was going to oppose it because it was the House of Representatives that holds the purse strings. So he couldn't stop it from being passed, but he was going to withhold funds from it. As the leader of the House of Representatives, he persuaded others who were similarly minded that it has been enacted, but we're going to do everything we can to sabotage it. And so this was a great debate at the time too. Can the House of Representatives, who in the Constitution is not to have anything to do with treaty making, still can they interfere? And so Madison tried. He was going to withhold funds. He was going to demand all of the documents involved in the treaty debates and those received from Great Britain. Washington said, no, I'm not giving you anything. We have a separation of powers here. The House of Representatives has nothing to do with the treaty-making process. This is your Constitution, buddy. You're the one, more than anyone, who decided on this Constitution. And this is when Washington, probably not very happily, but he released some of the notes from the Constitutional Convention, the official notes. And he let everybody know that Madison was emphatic when he decided in favor of the Senate and the executive alone determine treaties. It's not the House of Representatives. And so he got in a good one against Madison, and Madison had to back down at that point. But anyway, Madison and Jefferson at this point are making a team of each other, working together to undermine the Federalist policies, not so much Washington, but Alexander Hamilton, opposing him. And so they took a trip. It was allegedly a botany expedition, which I'm sure Jefferson thoroughly enjoyed through some of the northern states. But what they were really doing, in addition to the botany, which Jefferson, I'm sure, was involved with, they were trying to get support from as many as they could through the northern states, and making a tour of it trying to drum up more support for the Republican side as opposed to the Federalists. Later on, as Jefferson became president, yes?
They were getting support from the rich men, the rich white men, or is this common people?
Politically. So they're talking with representatives, senators, people of influence, and no doubt rich people as well. Anyone with influence, mainly political, but also the movers and the shakers, whoever they may be. So when Jefferson became president, Madison was the Secretary of State. Kind of an odd position for him, even though he's a very talented, highly intellectual, intelligent, and capable man. He'd never traveled, never been overseas. So he did not have the connections that someone who aspires to be the Secretary of State really should have. But all in all, he still did a wonderful job, just highly capable in working politically in that position. One thing that we can either give him credit or blame for at the end of Jefferson's administration was the embargo. It was Madison, more than any other advisor to Jefferson, who was pushing for it and believed wholeheartedly that the embargo would bring both France and England to their knees, and they will be begging for us to lift the embargo, and they will do anything they can, especially no longer would they attack our ships on the high seas, impress men from our ships, take the cargo, and basically harass our merchant marine out there. And he held to that. It ultimately did not work, and Madison really didn't learn from it, as we will see. So Madison and Jefferson became a great team through their lives, and people would generally see this team working together as Jefferson as the lead, the leading man in this duo, and he generally was at first. Near the end of Jefferson's administration, it became just the opposite. It was Madison who was the driving force between the two of them, and as Jefferson, in his last couple of years as president, was tired of it all, especially his last few months. I had mentioned last week that Jefferson retired probably 3 or 4 months early during his presidency and left it to Madison because he had just had enough. He didn't want to deal with it anymore. And Madison became then the driving force in this team. Then we move on to the glorious Dolly Madison. One of the great fortunes of James Madison's life was finding Dolly Madison. I talked before about John and Abigail as being a great team politically and just a great team together personally as President and First Lady. In another manner, James Madison and Dolly Madison were even better. Not so much politically. She did not contribute nearly to the extent that Abigail did. She didn't have the intelligence of Abigail, but then again, who does? But Dolly Madison was a great find for James because she provided the social graces that Madison entirely lacked when it came to socializing, parties, balls, making people feel welcome in the White House. It was Dolly Madison who did that, who brightened everyone's day. When when the two of them first met, Dolly Madison was a widow. She had been married and had a couple of kids. She was 26. He was 43. And he found out about her, and he talked with his good friend, Aaron Burr, who knew everybody. And it was said that when Dolly Madison walked the streets, went from one place to another, the men just oogled at her. Not so much because of her looks, because she wasn't, she was pretty, but it was her charm that just drove the men crazy. They loved her. Everybody loved her because she was so charming and gracious and friendly and welcoming that the men practically lined the streets to get an eye up on her and wanted her. But it was James Madison, who was 5'5", she's 5'7". He's probably 110 pounds soaking wet, the scrawniest president we've ever had, who attracted this 5'7", a little on the large side woman, and the two of them made a great team. Whatever it was, the chemistry was there. They fell madly in love with each other, and their letters, which are preserved, show that. Very affectionate throughout their life. So here's kind of a cartoonish look at the two of them together. But when he became president, as I said, he did not have the social graces. He did not smile at strangers. He sat there, or he stood in the room looking kind of like this. And it was Dolly Madison that people came to see, not James Madison, in their parties. And she became the first lady to be the arbiter of style. And she would wear these very fashionable turbans with ostrich feathers coming out. And she would wear all the right clothing, whether it's pearls, whatever necklaces were in fashion at the time. She's the one who set the trend. And people would fall over each other trying to get into the parties, the levees that they would put on in the White House. It became very much of a problem because the White House could only hold so many people. And transportation at this time actually was improving. They had the steamboat was now in operation. And so people from upriver, downriver would come to the parties at the White House, the receptions, because that was the thing to do. There was one party in particular that was so hot and crowded in the summertime, they broke the windows in the upper story to ventilate the place because it was so hot and muggy. And poor Dolly Madison worked herself into an illness time and time again. Her health suffered because she was so much in demand. Now, getting to the election of 1808, the Federalists were pretty much done for by this time. The election of 1800 was the turning point. The Federalists no longer had the draw that they once did. They looked like the old curmudgeons who were trying to kind of put a damper on the party. They did not come across, as Jefferson did, as welcoming, as conciliatory. And Jefferson, in his administration, pretty much put a nail in the coffin of the Federalists, and they slowly died out. And so in this election, you can see that the Republicans totally dominated. There wasn't much that, even though the embargo was so unpopular with Jefferson, and Madison, as his Secretary of State, supported it and pushed it. And yet even that was not enough to give the Federalists any kind of a boost. If there was a boost at all, it was pretty pathetic that they did so poorly in this election. Very curious election too. The Constitution had been, we have now the amendments fixing the vice presidency, so that you don't have the winner being the president and the guy who comes in second place as the vice president. Now you have it separated. So if you're going to run for the presidency, you're running just for the presidency. If you're running for the vice presidency, you are only running for the vice presidency. So you can put your name in that way. But the president and the vice president don't necessarily go together. So you'll have some guys running for the presidency, some guys running for the vice presidency. And who ends up with who could be anything. So, in addition, you could run for both, president and vice president. And George Clinton did that. And he wound up getting the vice presidency. So here's a guy who is running against you is now your vice president. Just like it could have happened before and did. But anyway, the Federalist Party was so dead by this time that it didn't matter. You can have two Republicans running for the presidency because there really wasn't a convention deciding on this. So anyway, Madison, in his 2 terms, had 3 vice presidents. George Clinton, who was Jefferson's second vice president, was running for president and vice president, and he won the vice presidency. Didn't get many votes for the presidency, but he became the vice president and died at the end of the first term, 1812. And so Elbridge Gerry became the next vice president, and he died in 1814 and succeeded by Daniel D. Tompkins. Now, Elbridge Gerry, that name might ring a bell for some people. Does anybody know what term we get from Elbridge Gerry? Very good. I knew somebody. You're very well-educated people here. So yeah, gerrymander. He's the guy who came up with rigging the electorate, and somebody came up with a cartoon showing a particular district and how squiggly and weird it looked, and it looked like a salamander. So he said, we'll call that gerrymandering. So here's our 3 vice presidents. There's Mr. Gerrymander himself. So Madison, he was known as a very studious, intelligent, unsociable, stern-faced sort of guy. So one, I think he was from Great Britain, came to the parties that Madison's had, and he's looking at James Madison. Says a very small, thin, pale-visaged man of a rather sour, reserved, and forbidding countenance. That was his description. Never seemed to smile at strangers. Madison's cabinet. He was very fortunate and very unfortunate in his cabinet. Now that the Republicans totally dominated, it's an interesting phenomenon, I think, that we have and are so used to our 2-party system that has been in place since before the Civil War, that you don't see the phenomenon of what happens when one party completely dies out. The other party splits. It's almost inevitable. And the Republicans, during Jefferson's administration, started doing that. For a while, the split started going 4 different directions. But as time progressed, they still held together. But you have rivalries. And so when Madison was choosing his cabinet, he wanted Albert Gallatin, who had been the Secretary of the Treasury under Jefferson, a very talented, highly intelligent, very capable man, as I mentioned before, but he wanted him as Secretary of State. But in the Senate, there were rivalries, as I said, and we have Samuel Smith, who has his idiot brother demanding that he get that position of Secretary of State. Now, Albert Gallatin, if he would have given up his position as Secretary of the Treasury, the Smiths in the Senate threatened basically that we will not confirm him if you try to get him as your Secretary of State, because they basically did not like Gallatin at all, and they would have preferred him be out of the government entirely. But he was the Secretary of the Treasury, had been confirmed, and so he didn't need to be confirmed again. So Madison had to keep him as Secretary of the Treasury, and Madison had to have this other guy, Robert Smith, as his Secretary Secretary of State. And as I said, Robert Smith was an idiot, totally incompetent, not able to perform his duties. So Madison was now his own Secretary of State, and had to prop up this guy, write his speeches, write the dispatches for him, because he just couldn't do it himself. So, once again, problems with Great Britain seems to be an ongoing thing, and had been since the beginning of Washington's administration, because of the Napoleonic Wars still going on. Great Britain dominates the seas. Great Britain stops the shipping as much as they can from trading with France. And so again, what do? We ended the embargo because temporarily Great Britain had lightened up a bit, but still there were problems. There was a treaty that we had agreed upon with a foreign minister from Great Britain, only to find out that this guy had gone beyond what he was supposed to, and he was not authorized to make a treaty as favorable as that one was. And so they sent another foreign minister to repudiate that agreement. So the first few months of Madison's administration, everybody was really happy because we thought we had a really good treaty with Great Britain finally, only to find out a few months later that Great Britain repudiated that agreement and sent another guy to replace the first, someone not nearly as nice. It became such a dire thing for Great Britain. They wanted to do anything to stop Napoleon, because Napoleon was running rampant through Europe, dominating everybody. And so Copenhagen, the Danes, were under heavy pressure from Napoleon. He wanted their navy. He was going to take it one way or another. And so Great Britain came to the Danes and basically said, you're going to give your navy to us because we don't want Napoleon to take it. And they said, no, we don't want to give up our shipping to you. And so they said, okay, fine, we're going to destroy Copenhagen. And they did. horrible tragedy. Hundreds and hundreds died in this attack, and then Great Britain took the navy from Denmark so that Napoleon wouldn't. So we come to the War of 1812, the war that we were not at all prepared for. The bank that so many Republicans hated, they grew to understand that it was necessary. And Madison and Jefferson used the bank for the purposes of running and paying for things in the government. However, the charter of the bank was due to expire in 1811, and so they were going to charter it again, and Madison was pushing for it. But there was still a lot of opposition. A lot of Republicans just did not like the centralizing power of that bank. And so it came down to a tie, and James Madison's vice president voted the tiebreaker against the bank. So he was not, in any sense, a loyal supporter of his president. So now that the bank is no longer in operation, the government, in order to get funds for the army that we need to raise, has to go to private banks, and they're not nearly so generous in their terms as the Bank of the United States was. The budget for the military and the Navy was slashed during Jefferson's administration, believing, as any good Republican did at that time, that armies and navies are generally used for tyranny against their own people. So, and they are so expensive that you create a debt that we want to get rid of. So the best thing to do for the Army and the Navy is to slash the budget, right up until the War of 1812. The general staff, grossly incompetent for the most part. The Secretary of War was a well-known alcoholic. He was good up until noon, and then he was no good the rest of the day because he was drinking. And Madison knew that. He appointed him, probably not knowing initially that he was an alcoholic of such a caliber, but he certainly found out before too long and did nothing about it, partially because the guy was well connected and would have been very difficult to get rid of. On the other hand, Madison, with the Republican mindset at the time, we don't care about the Navy or the military or the Army, so it doesn't matter. We don't need them, right up until the War of 1812. And their reliance was on the state militia. We do not want a standing army because they are costly. So we rely on the state militia to do the job initially in any given conflict. And that notion that the state militia can be effective in a general engagement died very hard at the beginning of the war. The goal in this war, now that we are fighting Great Britain, take Canada. Canada will be the bargaining chip. Canada is ripe for taking. Lightly guarded cities, we want Quebec and Montreal. If we can take those two cities, we have Canada, and Great Britain will have to come to terms with us in order to get it back. That is, if we want to give it back at all. Maybe we'll just keep Canada. That was the plan. And so with our state militias, crack troops, and incompetent generals, we send them up there to take Montreal, to take Quebec, and they fail miserably, even though they were right. Neither one of these cities was well guarded. The Napoleonic Wars are raging at this point, and so Great Britain can't spare a lot of men for Canada, and yet the state militias so incompetent, both in their leadership and in the men themselves. Some of the men, several of them, go up to the border of Canada and say, I'm a state militia. I'm not going to invade another country. We're not going. And so that ended very quickly this, what could have been with regular troops, something that could have been successful, but it failed miserably. And instead of us invading Canada, Canada invaded Michigan and took Detroit along with the territory up there. And yet, with all these failures, the one thing, ironically, that we did succeed in was protecting the Great Lakes. Some great victories on the Great Lakes secured some sort of victory for us in the initial months. And so the election of 1812, the Federalists got something of a boost because of the gross failures in this war. But still, it was looking pretty bad. But ultimately, we kind of broke even in the War of 1812. We didn't deserve to. We should have failed miserably. But on the other hand, as I said, Canada was not very competently defended either. And so they had their fair share of disasters that they didn't really need to have. So we win some battles on the Great Lakes. The British are repelled in New York because of their incompetence. They burned Washington, D.C., as we well know. Madison did his best with his terribly incompetent Secretary of War. They did not secure Washington, D.C. They did not protect it. And so the British invaded, burned the city and the White House down to the ground, accomplished almost nothing otherwise. Militarily, it was a foolish thing to do. It was more for show than anything else. And then, of course, the famous bombardment of Fort McHenry, from which we get what? Thank you. You guys are sharp. So that was a great victory protecting Baltimore at the time. So at that point, Great Britain, still wanting to defeat Napoleon, decides that, well, we've had enough. We don't need to continue this, especially when they approached Wellington, who I should say, Napoleon actually had been defeated by Wellington at this point, and they say they're wanting to send Wellington to America to defeat the troublesome Americans, and he says, you know, there's no point. There's no point in doing that. Just call it a day and get what you can from a treaty and be done with it. And so that's pretty much what happened. And so at the end of 1814, the treaty signed basically said, we're going to go back to the beginning. Nobody gets anything. Status quo, antebellum is the term. And then, after that was decided, we have a wonderfully glorious victory with Andrew Jackson in New Orleans in January of 1815. Oddly enough, even though it was after the treaty had been decided upon, it was an important victory. It showed the British that we are protecting this new territory of ours. Great Britain had never really signed on to the idea of the United States taking New Orleans and the Louisiana Territory, and may have in the future, if they would have won that battle. The treaty that was signed said nothing about that. and Great Britain could have caused an awful lot of problems if they would have won that battle, which, by the way, and I won't get into this too much, they really could have. Andrew Jackson made some serious blunders in protecting New Orleans, and the British general at the time did not take advantage and suffered a horrific, lopsided loss. So here's Washington burning, and then here's our Star-Spangled Banner, Fort McHenry. So Madison, as a war president, though grossly unprepared, he was the type of guy who didn't panic. Highly intelligent, as we know, facing great threat of invasion, and this is to his credit. This was one of the most serious crises of our nation's history, the invasion of our shores. And Madison, to his credit, did not curtail the rights of the citizens. He did not impose martial law. He did not start rounding people up and putting them in prison on false charges or charges of espionage or anything like that. As we know, in other wartime situations, there's always a great scare of the enemy. World War I, Wilson rounded up quite a few during the Red Scare, put many people in prison, and of course we know very well what happened in World War II with the Japanese and many others who could be put in prison and detained without being charged. So Madison was not like that. He was one of the few who kept his head and did not feel the need to curtail the rights of the citizens. Eventually, the most incompetent of the administration were let go and replaced with more competent men in those positions. And moving on, so there's the James Madison Memorial. Very interesting. Okay, I am getting way behind, so I gotta move on to James Monroe.